Okay, welcome back to Growth 101. Today we're going to talk about retention. I'm really just going to briefly touch on two of the six main areas of focus for retention. Again, retention is a huge, broad topic that is critical to every startup, really every company, regardless of industry. We're going to talk about an overview of retention today, and then some of the key retention metrics that I like to look at. And with Mastering Growth, if you're interested in this topic, we go into a lot more detail with a lot more of these topics listed below and a bunch of additional stuff as well. So I'd urge you to take a look at that or just reach out to me with questions if you want to learn more about that program. Let's start with some definitions. So what is retention? Well, retention really is just a measurement of how long your users stick around and how long that they're active and engaged with your business. This is probably the most important metric of any business, regardless of what your business model is. Now, when we talk about a retention rate, this is going to measure the percentage of users that are still active using your product after a certain amount of time. By active, we mean what core action you measure retention on is how you're going to define active. This may be something like articles read if you're a media company, or purchasing if you're transactionally selling things, or subscribers or subscriptions if you're a SaaS company. There's a lot of different metrics at play here, but really the typical way that we're going to measure retention is going to be in intervals that are going to probably be monthly, biannual, or annual, but monthly is really the most common way to kind of track retention overall. So for example, subscribers continue paying month to month for my product for a year. Or a user purchases more than 4 times in 6 months. That might be an example of a business to consumer transactional model. Or a user logs in more than 1 time per month each month for more than 6 months. That might be a social application, a consumer social application, where there's really not a revenue metric that they're tracking for retention. It's more around user engagement and logins. Now, the famous case is probably Netflix. They're used often as an amazing case study on retention. And according to Gibson Biddle, who I've taken a ton of inspiration from, he was the VP of product. He was the former VP of product at Netflix. He said that at Netflix, retention over time looked something like this. In the early days of their product, roughly 10% of members churned or canceled each month. In 2005, that was down to about 5% each month. And today, based on some of the public data that I've seen, somewhere between 2 and 5%, 2 and 2.5% of users will churn every month, depending on kind of what source you look at. Now, what are the normal benchmarks? Again, retention is going to vary wildly by industry and business type and by your pricing strategy. But for retention, when you look at retention over a 6-month period, so the number of people or the percentage of people retained after 6 months, consumer social, good to great, consumer transactional, consumer SaaS, and SMB mid-market, as well as enterprise look like this. So consumer social, good retention after 6 months would be 25%. Great would be 45%. So I'll let you kind of absorb this for a second. This was done based on some articles that were written by Lenny Rachesky and Casey Winners, both really great growth people. And I pulled this from some of the benchmarks. And this is very consistent with what I see with a lot of the companies that I work with. Now, why is this important? Even with amazing customer acquisition, great early activation, poor retention could actually tank. It could really kill your business. Without strong retention or pricing that matches your retention rates, for example, if you're a low volume enterprise model, you're going to be in a constant state of fixing a leaky bucket and spending more and more money over time to try to get new customers to replace all the ones that are leaving. And that takes its toll on your business after a while, and it's not sustainable. Okay, well, what is churn? Churn is the number or percentage of people that no longer use your product as defined by your active metric. So some common measures of churn would be somebody unsubscribes, a user doesn't purchase again within 6 months, they don't open the app within 90 days. Now, again, we're not going to go into a ton of detail on this today, but when you look at the revenue impact of different churn scenarios, the column on the left is a company that has 1,000 new subscribers coming in per month, but they retain 90% of their customers, right? The company on the right gets 2,000 customers a month, but they only retain 50%. Look at the bottom line. Even though company one spent half as much money on customer acquisition, they did $114,000 more in revenue. So there's a stark difference here. So if you're running a startup and you don't understand what your retention metrics are, it's time to pause and really start to figure that out, because this is really critically important. I often talk a lot about core and proxy retention metrics. So if you don't have a retention model yet, don't worry. You can build one as you go, but you need to understand what your core retention metric is, and then at least one proxy metric that you think most closely impacts retention. So the core retention metric here, just from a definition standpoint, is the metric that you're going to use to measure success or failure of your entire retention model. So example metrics here for Netflix, their core retention metric is monthly active subscribers. For Growth University, our core retention metric is daily active students or monthly active subscribers. Those are both really important retention metrics for us. For Zoom, it's going to be something likely around user churn or user retention for the month. And with Sandbox's core retention are around ARPU and LTV, right? So these are indicators that people are sticking around in a way to kind of give you an anchor by which you can kind of view all of these different scenarios from. Now, retention takes a long time to report on, at least 3 months, probably 6 months. You may not even really understand your retention truly for a year or more into the business. So what do? You can't wait a year to make decisions on retention if it takes that long to report on it. This is where proxy metrics come in. So proxy retention metrics are the metrics that you use to measure how likely a user is to positively impact your core retention metric. And this is best through an example. So for Netflix, if Netflix can get users to consume a healthy number of hours of content per month, they know that user's not going to churn. I've seen publicly they talk about 19 hours. I'm not sure if that's still true or not. With Growth University, we know that if a student consumes 10 lessons or more, they're highly likely to stick around. They'll take more programs and courses. They'll be more engaged. Zoom, if they can get free users to set up calls more than one time per week for 6 weeks, then that's an indicator that that user is a power user and will become a real client. And Sandbox, if we can get a letter writer to send over 2 letters in their first week, we know, or they know, that that's the measure of a retained customer. So these are very action or activity-based metrics. So proxy metrics here are going to be used as a gauge for basically looking at channels and experiments and cohort fits. All of these things, you're going to use these core and proxy retention metrics to kind of measure against, and you're going to use these as building blocks as you go. And again, a lot of this stuff is out of scope for the Growth 101 program, but just know that you're probably going to have more than one of these proxy metrics over time. And again, these proxy metrics are supposed to be leading metrics. And so you want to define those one or more for your company. Again, because this is so broad, we can't get into a ton of detail here, but Mastering Growth does cover off on all this stuff, including cohorts, charting retention, channel-based retention, LTV to CAC ratios, how to improve retention, and a whole lot of additional things as well. So I'd urge you to check that out if you have some time. But before we end today, I want to just walk you through what cohorts are, because this is really important when you're thinking about retention. You have to think about retention as it relates to weekly or monthly cohorts. And so put simply, cohorts are groups of people that are put together based on some criteria, usually by when they signed up or when they first purchased. You may track things like ARPU for users over 12 months who signed up in a given month. So what happened to the ARPU for users that came in January, and then in February, and then in March? Is that getting higher over time? That's a positive signal. You might track retention by sign up channel and by month, or something else that could work, like a purchase behavior of referred users versus paid users, for example. These are all things that you can bucket together in cohorts and learn from, and basically help to leverage when you're thinking about even what product features to build and how to get and go to market. When we look at some examples here, I'm going to show you two charts. This is an example of one of my properties where we're looking at 10-week user retention across the board. And you can see by week 3, retention is even in this highlighted in red area, this July 26th to August 1st, we're at 4% retention at week 3. So this is looking at all users who came in and were consuming something on one of my sites. But we're showing some progress here. It's actually getting better. That week 3 is actually getting stronger over time. August is getting even better, right? These numbers are low though. So if your retention metrics look like this, you probably need to figure out, well, what's happening with these cohorts and why is what I'm doing maybe not resonating with the broader audience all that well? So you want to look at that because that could be an indicator of some kind of problem that you have. This same chart though, now all we changed is that we're looking at returning users. These metrics look a lot better. So when I filter out all the people that only came in one time to this property, I get rid of them. Now my week 1, 2, 3, these metrics are 5 to 10x improved over the more broad view because we've filtered out those one and done users. So again, you can look at these metrics from a lot of different angles, but you're going to want to kind of poke holes in your model and look at your kind of your overall retention. And then you're going to want to break it down by cohort and use different segments to view this data multiple different ways. And again, we get so much better if we get somebody back one time. And when I would look at this, I would say, maybe if you showed me the start, I would say you might have a cold start problem where you've got users who, some users are churning, some are sticking around. Find areas to improve to get them to stick around more and double down on that stuff. And you're likely to be able to increase those retention metrics. Again, in terms of ways to improve retention, there's 6 ways that I typically outline. Today, we'll focus on the first of 6, focusing on new users. So with new users, we have the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? Maybe, but when you've got users that are already using a product, it is true. It's really hard to reset their expectations of value. They've been in and they know what they're getting, and it's really hard to change that first experience that they got. You can't change that. You can leverage experiments to test this out and use your proxy metrics as leading indicators of success. So if you have the luxury of having new users constantly coming in, you can run a lot of experiments on these early users to see what sticks and what resonates with them compared to what you were doing in the past. Dan Hockenmeyer, who does a lot with Reforge, said that almost every big lasting retention win that he's seen came from improving the early user experience, always within 30 days and often within 7 days of sign up. So, I mean, some ideas that I have, I'm not going to walk you through all of these, but basically these are some tactical ways that you can try to influence this early focus, this first experience that the customer or the user is going to have with your platform. So I would urge you to kind of try some of these ideas out. Now, these require work, right? So if you just take one of those tactics, there's a bunch of stuff that you're going to need to do to try to influence those metrics. So just know that retention can be changed. And I would urge you strongly to try to change and make your retention better by mostly focusing on those new users in that first experience. But it does require work. You're going to have to really dig in and kind of get some work done to test things and get new things in front of people. You'll want to measure that impact, modify, iterate, and as you go. But considerations do, for this type of experiment, are users self-selecting in a test? Again, this gets pretty nuanced. So I'm going to blow through this relatively quickly, but you ultimately want to look at, did whatever I just do, did that improve my metrics or did they just stay the same, right? With onboarding, you want to make kind of radical changes often early, quickly if you can, to try to quickly build that feedback loop to improve those retention metrics. And then you rinse and repeat as you go. Measure things on cohort and track against a control, which is basically your baseline or your standard behavior that you measured your users on in the past. So hopefully that was helpful. Again, another whirlwind tour of retention. There's a lot more to unpack here, but I wanted to at least give you a teaser for some of the things that we like to look at. And hopefully there was some value there that you can take away and start applying today to your startup.